She was just a poor girl, forced to trade her dreams for survival. He was the golden heir, returning home to find a bride from wealth. But when their worlds collided in the shadows of a cold mansion, a forbidden connection sparked, hidden, dangerous, and deeply human. This is the story of Grace, a girl with nothing, and Daniel, a man who had everything but peace. What happens when love grows where it's least expected, and when hearts dare to cross lines that were never meant to be crossed? Stay with us, because what began as survival may soon become a love that risks everything. Grace Thompson was only 17 when her world changed forever. She was in her final year of school, dreaming of becoming a nurse one day. Her father, a kind carpenter, had always told her, "One day, you'll wear that white uniform, and I'll be the proudest man in the world." He believed in her more than anyone else. But dreams can be delicate, and life cruel. One rainy evening, her father never came back home. There was a knock on the door. Two men stood there, soaked and silent. One of them finally spoke. "There was an accident. A lorry lost control. We're so sorry." Just like that, Grace's world fell apart. Her mother, already battling diabetes, collapsed in tears. Grace held her little brother, Michael, who was just 8. He kept asking, "Where's Daddy? Why isn't he coming back?" But Grace had no answer. Their father had been the family's only source of income. Without him, things changed quickly. Bills piled up. There was no more food in the cupboard. The fridge was empty. Her mother's insulin ran low. Grace tried to stay strong. She dropped out of school, though it broke her heart. She knew her father would have hated that. But someone had to take care of the family now. She found a cleaning job in a small shop. Paid little, but she smiled and worked hard. On other days, she sold groundnuts by the roadside or helped carry goods in the market. She'd leave home early and return late, her hands bruised, her clothes dusty. But it was never enough. Some days they ate once, other days not at all. Grace would lie to her brother, saying she wasn't hungry just so he could eat the little they had. Her mother's health worsened. The insulin was finished. Grace begged at the local clinic, but they turned her away. "No money, no medicine," the nurse said coldly. One night, Grace sat outside their tiny house. The roof leaked, and the wind was cold. She hugged her knees and cried quietly. "God, are you still there?" she whispered. "I'm trying. I really am." She looked up at the stars and remembered her father's face, warm, smiling, full of hope. She missed him. She missed the sound of him humming as he worked. She missed his hand on her head, saying, "You're my strong girl." But now strength wasn't a choice. It was survival. Her little brother still believed everything was okay. He believed because Grace told him it was. But her heart was tired. Her mother had lost weight, and sometimes her hands shook from hunger and sickness. Grace wanted to scream, to run, to break down. But instead, she stood every morning, wiped her tears, and went out to find another way. Each day was a fight. Each night was a prayer. And deep down, a small light stayed alive in her heart. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, something would change. That someone, somewhere, would notice them. That her mother would smile again. That Michael would go back to school. That she could dream again. But as the days turned to weeks, and the struggle got harder, Grace started to wonder, was that too much to ask? It was a hot afternoon when Grace came home from work, her shirt damp with sweat and dust on her slippers. Her arms ached from carrying loads at the market. All she wanted was to check on her mother and lie down for a bit. But as she turned the corner to their tiny house, she stopped. 2 expensive black cars were parked outside. For a moment, her heart raced. Had something happened? Were they in trouble? She rushed to the door and opened it quickly. Inside, her mother was sitting up on the small wooden chair, talking to 2 strangers. A well-dressed man in a suit and a beautiful woman with shiny jewelry. Her mother looked tired, but she was smiling, and little Michael was standing shyly beside her. The woman turned to Grace and smiled gently. "You must be Grace." Grace nodded slowly. "Yes, good afternoon. My name is Mrs. Blake," the woman said. "And this is my husband, Mr. Blake. We heard about your situation through a friend who runs a small clinic here. We came to speak with your mother. And now with you." Grace looked at her mother, who gave her a weak smile. "Grace, they came with an offer," she said softly. Mr. Blake cleared his throat. "We live in the city. We have a large house and need someone to help with house chores, cooking, cleaning, laundry, that sort of thing. It's a live-in position." Grace blinked. "You want me to come work for you?" Mrs. Blake nodded. "Yes, and in return we'll send money every month for your mother's medicine, for your brother's food and needs. We'll make sure they're okay." Grace's heart beat faster. It sounded like a dream, but also a sacrifice. She sat down, her legs trembling slightly. I wanted to go back to school," she said quietly, almost ashamed to say it. "I wanted to be a nurse. That was my dream." Mrs. Blake looked at her kindly, but her voice was firm. "I understand, but right now your family needs you. And maybe if you work hard and prove yourself, who knows? We might help you chase that dream someday." Grace looked at her mother again. Her hands were shaking, not just from illness, but from the hope this offer carried. Her mother had aged so much in just a few months. Her eyes were tired, but filled with worry for her children. Grace's voice cracked. "Mama, what do you think?" Her mother took her hand. "My daughter, I don't want you to suffer, but I also don't want to die before my time. If this helps us, then maybe you should go. But only if your heart agrees." Grace didn't speak for a long while. She thought of her father's dreams, of her school bag that now sat unused, of her brother's innocent laughter, and her mother's frail health. She thought of the hunger, the hopelessness, and the long nights of silent tears. Then she made her decision. "I'll go," she said softly, holding back her tears. "For you, for Michael. I'll do it." Mrs. Blake smiled. "Good. Pack your things. We leave tomorrow morning." That night, Grace didn't sleep much. She lay beside her brother, watching his tiny chest rise and fall. She stroked her mother's hair as she dozed. Her heart was heavy, but a little stronger. She was leaving behind everything familiar, everything that once made her feel safe. But maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Not her dream, not yet, but a deal for survival. The car ride to the city was quiet. Grace sat in the back seat, holding tightly to her small bag. It had only 2 dresses, 1 wrapper, and a framed photo of her family. That was all she owned now. The city roads were smooth and fast, nothing like the dusty paths in her village. But instead of excitement, her stomach was heavy with fear. When the tall iron gates of the Blake estate slowly opened, her eyes widened. It was the biggest house she had ever seen. The mansion looked like something from a dream, white walls that sparkled under the sun. Huge windows, tall trees, and flowers of all colors lined up neatly on both sides. Everything was perfect. Everything except how it made her feel. Small. They entered the compound, and the car stopped in front of the grand steps. A guard opened the door for her. Grace stepped out slowly, feeling the stares of workers and passers-by. She didn't belong here, and she knew it. Mrs. Blake, now in her usual cold tone, said, "You'll start work tomorrow. We don't tolerate laziness. Is that clear?" Grace nodded quickly. "Yes, Ma." The maid supervisor, an older woman named Ruth, came to meet them. She gave Grace a small forced smile, then led her through a back entrance. "Follow me." They passed through long corridors with shiny floors and gold-framed pictures. Grace walked quietly, her eyes scanning everything. She could smell sweet perfume, expensive food, and the coldness of polished marble. Finally, Ruth stopped in front of a tiny door beside the kitchen. She opened it. "This is your room." Grace stepped in. It was not a room. It was a small store with no window, no fan, and barely enough space to stretch her legs. A worn-out mat was rolled in the corner. No pillow, no blanket, just a rusted bucket in one corner, and one cracked bulb hanging above. She stood in silence. "This is where you'll sleep," Ruth said again, her tone matter-of-fact. "Wake up by 5 a.m. sharp. You clean the house, wash clothes, mop the floors, and help in the kitchen. Mrs. Blake likes everything spotless. Her daughter, Charlotte, is picky too. Don't talk back. Don't be slow. And don't go near the upstairs living quarters unless you're sent." Grace swallowed hard. "Yes, Ma." The next morning started early, too early. The alarm clock in her mind rang before the sun came up. She brushed her teeth from a bowl of water, washed her face quickly, and tied her scarf. She was already scrubbing the living room floors when Charlotte came downstairs. Charlotte was around her age, maybe slightly older, but everything about her screamed money. Her smooth skin, her branded slippers, and her shiny hair. She took one look at Grace and laughed. "Oh, so this is the village girl?" she said loudly to her friend on the phone. "Mum said she's doing us a favor by bringing her in. Honestly, she smells like fish water." Grace kept scrubbing, pretending not to hear. It became a daily routine. Grace worked from early morning until late at night. She cleaned toilets, swept long hallways, ironed Charlotte's clothes, served guests, and mopped the marble floors until her fingers turned red. Sometimes there was no breakfast. Other times she got leftovers, dry bread, soup that was almost sour, or rice with no meat. Her stomach growled, but she didn't complain. Mrs. Blake never smiled. Every time she saw Grace, it was as if she was looking at dirt. "You should be grateful," she would say. "If it weren't for us, your mother would be dead by now." Those words always pierced Grace's heart like a knife. She missed her mother and brother. Every night she thought about them. Were they eating well? Was her mother's blood sugar okay? Were they really fine, as Mrs. Blake claimed? She had no phone to call, no one to ask, just hope. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, Grace sat on her little mat. Her feet were swollen. Her back ached. She pulled out the photo of her family and held it close. "I miss you, Mama," she whispered. "I hope you're okay. I hope Michael is still smiling." A tear rolled down her cheek. She thought of her old school uniform, now long gone. She remembered her dreams of being a nurse, of helping people, of giving injections carefully like the clinic woman used to do. Now she was the one being stepped on. Clean this. Wash that. Stay invisible. But somehow she never gave up, because in that cold mansion, in the midst of harsh words and cruel laughter, she carried one thing with her, her reason, her mother, her brother. Every insult she endured, every painful scrub of the floor, it was for them. But it was getting harder. Charlotte would sometimes throw things on the floor on purpose, just so Grace could pick them up. "Oops, you missed a spot. Don't be lazy." Once, Grace forgot to add enough sugar to Mrs. Blake's tea, and she was slapped across the face. "This is why poor people shouldn't be trusted," Mrs. Blake snapped. Grace went to her room that night with a swollen cheek. No one asked if she was okay, not even Ruth. Still, she stayed. She cried in silence, wiped her tears, and woke up the next morning like nothing happened, because she had no choice. This was the price she had to pay. It was not a home, not a job with dignity, but a deal for survival. And somewhere deep inside her tired heart, she still believed. Maybe, just maybe, something better was coming. She just didn't know it yet. Grace had learned to smile through pain. She had learned to clean with hunger in her belly and bruises on her back. The ache in her legs had become normal, and her tears had learned to wait until everyone was asleep. One afternoon, while washing dishes in the hot kitchen, Ruth walked in holding an envelope. "This came for you, from your village." Grace's heart jumped. She wiped her wet hands and took the envelope with shaking fingers. It had her name on it, Grace Thompson, written in her mother's careful handwriting. She opened it slowly. Inside was a small piece of folded paper. It read, "My dearest Grace, thank you, my child. Because of you, I now take my insulin every day. Michael is also eating well. God will bless you. You are our light in the darkness. I know you are sacrificing so much for us. I pray for you every night. Stay strong, my daughter. We love you so much. Love, Mama." Grace pressed the letter to her chest and sat on the kitchen floor. Silent tears ran down her cheeks. That small paper gave her a reason to breathe again. But the pain returned quickly. That same evening, Mrs. Blake had visitors. Wealthy friends in shiny clothes with diamond watches and high heels that echoed through the halls. Grace served them drinks while Charlotte gave her nasty looks. "This is the girl I told you about," Charlotte said loudly. "The village maid Mum brought from the gutter." The guests laughed. "She looks so lost." One of them whispered. Charlotte smiled cruelly. "She is. She once used a fork to flip pancakes. I almost died." Laughter filled the room again. Grace stood there, holding a tray, her ears burning with shame. She kept her eyes on the floor, pretending not to hear. Later, in the hallway, Charlotte pushed her. "Next time, move faster. You don't belong here." Every day they reminded her that she was poor. Every mistake was punished. Every silence was treated like stupidity. One day, while scrubbing the bathroom, Grace whispered to herself, "I can't do this anymore." She thought of running away, of going back home even if it meant hunger. But then, she remembered the letter. Her mother's words. "You are our light in the darkness." How could she leave now? Her mother was alive because of this job. Her brother was smiling again. If she left, everything might fall apart. So she stayed. Not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. Grace had become invisible in a house full of light. But she carried her pain with quiet strength, waiting for the day someone would finally see her. The Blake mansion buzzed with excitement one sunny morning. The air smelled different, like new perfume, fresh roses, and expensive hope. Mrs. Evelyn Blake rushed through the house, giving orders to everyone. "Polish the floors again," she shouted. "And make sure Daniel's room is spotless. He's arriving tomorrow." Daniel Blake, the only son, the golden boy, the tech genius who had just sold an AI startup for millions of dollars. His name was all over the news. TV, newspapers, blogs. Daniel Blake, the young billionaire who changed the world before 30. But his return wasn't just a casual visit. His mother had called him weeks earlier, her voice firm but sweet. "Daniel, you've made money. Now it's time to build a proper life. Come home. Let's find you a suitable wife, someone of class and good background. It's time to settle down." He didn't argue. He never did with his mother. So he agreed to return just as she asked. Grace stood in the corner, silently mopping the same tile she'd cleaned an hour ago. Her back ached, her arms sore. She hadn't even seen this man, but already, his return was stressing her world. Mrs. Blake was glowing. "My son is coming home," she told her friends over wine. "And I'll make sure he marries well. Not just anyone. Someone with class, elegance, a proper background." She turned to her daughter Charlotte. "Invite the Johnsons, the Thompsons, the Montgomery girls, all their daughters. We'll host a dinner party he won't forget." Charlotte giggled. "Yes, Mum. Daniel deserves the best. Not just anybody." Her eyes flicked to Grace. That night, Grace sat on the cold floor of her tiny room, hugging her knees to her chest. She looked at her reflection in the broken mirror. Rough hands, tired eyes, messy hair tied in a weak bun. Her clothes were faded and old. She could hear the others laughing in the big rooms above her, planning dresses and menus. She was just a maid, in a mansion full of lights, music, and luxury. She was a ghost. The next day, Daniel arrived. A sleek black car pulled up in front of the mansion. Cameras flashed. Reporters tried to get a glimpse. The gates opened. Grace watched from behind the kitchen curtains. He stepped out, tall and handsome. Broad shoulders, smooth caramel skin, sharp jawline, and warm eyes that held a quiet mystery. Dressed simply, but still stunning. Grace's heart skipped. He looked nothing like the arrogant rich men she'd served. There was something different in his smile. Gentle, almost kind. He hugged his mother. "Hi, Mum. You look good." "My son," Mrs. Blake cried dramatically, squeezing him. "You've made me proud. So proud." Then she whispered softly but firmly into his ear. "Don't forget why you're here. It's time to find a wife, Daniel. I've already invited the best girls." Charlotte threw her arms around him too. "Big bro, I can't believe you're home." As he walked into the mansion, their voices followed him like perfume. But Grace stayed in her corner, unnoticed. Holding a tray of lemon water, her head bowed. Later that evening, the house transformed. Candles, music, long tables, crystal glasses. All the girls Mrs. Blake invited were dressed in designer gowns. Sparkling jewelry. High heels clicking across marble. They giggled and blushed as Daniel walked past them. He smiled politely, shook hands, said thank you. But his eyes wandered quietly, searching for something. Grace moved silently, pouring drinks, clearing plates, picking up fallen napkins. She avoided his gaze. But once, just once, their eyes met. She looked away quickly. But he didn't. Daniel tilted his head slightly, curious. "Who's that?" he asked his sister later. "Oh, that's no one," Charlotte replied with a laugh. "Just the help. Mum brought her from some village." Daniel didn't say anything, but that answer sat wrong in his heart. The next few days were worse for Grace. The girls treated her like trash. "Don't touch my dress, village girl," one snapped when she brushed past Grace by accident. "You'll ruin the fabric." Another laughed as Grace accidentally spilled water. "Do they not teach you how to walk in your village?" Charlotte was the worst. "Maybe you should go back home. I am not sure you deserve being seen by my brother. The sight of you will definitely spoil his visit." Grace said nothing. She swallowed her pain, buried it deep, and kept working. She wanted to leave. Every day, she imagined packing up and running away. But her mother's voice echoed in her heart. "Thank you, Grace. We're surviving because of you." So she stayed. For them. But she didn't know that someone had started to notice her. Someone who saw past the apron, the messy hair, the tired eyes. Daniel Blake had started watching the girl no one saw. And slowly, silently, his heart was drawn to the quiet maid with sad eyes and a soul that refused to break. She didn't try to impress. She didn't even lift her head when he walked past. She wore no perfume, no fancy dress, just an old blouse, a plain wrapper skirt, and a tired look in her eyes. But there was something in those eyes that held his gaze. Sadness, strength, and a softness that pulled him in. Daniel returned to his room earlier than usual, tired of the shallow conversations downstairs. When he opened the door, she was there, on her knees, scrubbing a corner of his spotless marble floor with quiet focus. She gasped, standing up fast. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know you were." No, it's okay," Daniel said gently. "Take your time." He sat on the edge of the bed, his gaze soft. "What's your name?" She hesitated, unsure whether to speak. "Grace," she finally whispered. "That's a beautiful name." She nodded awkwardly and bent down to pick up her rag. "Do you live here?" he asked. She nodded again. "I work here. I sleep downstairs, in the back room." "You're young," he said quietly. "Why aren't you in school?" Her hands paused, her head lowered. "My father died last year," she began softly. "My mum is diabetic. I had to stop school, work here to support them." They said they'd help my family if I stayed. Daniel's chest tightened. I'm sorry, he said after a long silence. Grace didn't look up. It's okay, sir. I just want to take care of them. That's all. She quickly gathered her bucket and cleaning cloth, ready to leave. Thank you for sharing that, Daniel said. Grace nodded and quietly stepped out. That night he couldn't sleep. The glitz and glamour of his home suddenly felt bitter. His mind kept going back to her voice. So soft, so sincere. He began watching her from a distance. At breakfast, while his mother bragged about society events, Grace was already sweeping the garden path. During parties, while the girls laughed in designer heels, Grace was bent over dirty dishes in the kitchen. But it wasn't just her story that touched him. It was how they treated her. Daniel started noticing the way his mother, Evelyn, spoke to Grace loud, dismissive, always reminding her she was lucky to be in their house. He noticed how Charlotte, his sister, would roll her eyes and leave messes for Grace to clean, on purpose, then call her lazy if she wasn't fast enough. He noticed how guests threw napkins at her feet, spilled wine on purpose, and laughed when she nervously tried to clean it up. Some girls are made for scrubbing floors, one guest whispered, and they all laughed. But Grace never flinched. She lowered her head and kept working, as if their cruelty was part of the job description. Daniel's heart broke a little more each time. He wanted to speak up, to stop it, to defend her. But he knew his voice, in that moment, would only make things worse for her. If he protected her too openly, they'd only punish her in silence. More chores, less food, more mockery. So he watched. And every time she was insulted and didn't break, his admiration grew. One rainy evening, something unexpected happened. Daniel, while searching for an umbrella, walked into her room without knocking. Grace had just finished her bath in the small corner bathroom. She stepped out, wrapped only in a towel, steam rising behind her. Their eyes locked. Her body froze. Daniel's breath caught. The towel clung to her wet skin, her shoulders bare, her hair damp and falling over one eye. She looked vulnerable, shocked, and stunning. I'm sorry, sir, she gasped, clutching the towel. I'm sorry, Daniel said, turning away instantly. I didn't know. She rushed back into the bathroom, her heart pounding. Daniel stood frozen, staring at the wall, guilt washing over him, but also something deeper. Not lust, surprise, because even in that fragile moment, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that humbled him. She was beautiful, not because of how she looked, though she was, but because of how she endured, how she carried pain without bitterness, how she worked while being humiliated and still found the strength to smile when no one was watching. From that day, everything changed. Daniel started seeing her not as a maid, but as someone far more noble than anyone else in that mansion. And slowly, Grace began to notice something too. Not the billionaire, but the man who listened, the one who saw her, the only one who made her feel human. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy. Not peaceful, but full of something unspoken. Grace stood alone in the back garden, under the moonlight, her hands wet from washing plates, her heart even heavier than her tray. She wasn't sure when it started. Maybe it was the way Daniel looked at her, not like the others, not like she was a burden or someone dirty. He looked at her like she mattered, like she wasn't just a maid, but someone worth noticing. First, she avoided him. Whenever he walked into a room, she slipped out. When he smiled, she bowed and turned away. When he said, "Good morning," she whispered, "Good morning, sir," and quickly lowered her eyes, not because she was rude, because she was afraid. Afraid of what it might mean, afraid of how it made her feel, afraid of what everyone else would do if they found out. She was a maid. Poor girl. She slept on a mat near the kitchen. He was a billionaire and also a billionaire's son, the golden prince of their world. What was she to him? Nothing, right? But Daniel didn't stop. He found small ways to speak with her. Moments no one else noticed. A passing smile in the hallway. Did you eat today? When he caught her in the pantry. Are you okay? When she looked especially tired. And Grace started to feel it. The warmth, the attention, the care. Scared her. Because for the first time in a long time she didn't feel invisible. One evening, as she was placing his clothes in his wardrobe, Daniel gently closed the door behind him. You always run away, he said softly. Grace froze. I have work, she said quickly, not meeting his eyes. Daniel stepped closer. Grace, you don't have to be scared of me. She looked up. Her eyes were tired, but her heart was louder. I'm not scared of you, she said. I'm scared of what this could mean. What could mean? You, talking to me like this, looking at me like that. Like what? Like I'm special, she said, her voice cracking. I'm not. I'm just a girl trying to survive. Daniel stepped closer. You're not just anything. She shook her head. You don't understand. If your mother finds out, they'll send me away. My mom, she needs the money. My little brother, they'll suffer. His voice softened. I would never let that happen. But you don't get it, she whispered, holding back tears. This house is not safe for someone like me. I'm only here because they promised to help my family. I can't risk it. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he sat on the edge of the bed. I don't know what's happening between us, he said quietly. But I know I see you, and I care. Grace's heart thumped. She had never heard those words from anyone before. Not like that. Not directed at her. But the fear was louder. What if you're just bored? She asked. What if I'm just something new to you? What happens when you're done? Daniel's expression didn't change. Then why do I still think about you at night? She looked at the floor, confused, scared, and more than anything torn. She wanted to run. She wanted to stay. She felt dirty for even wanting him. But every time he was near, her body betrayed her heart. She had seen how rich girls acted around him. Perfect hair, perfect smiles, confidence like they owned the world. And here she was, hands always rough from soap, hair untidy, body tired from endless chores. Why her? Why would someone like Daniel see someone like her? Was he taking advantage of her kindness? Her weakness? Would she be used and then thrown away? She told herself to stop. She told herself it was wrong. But her heart, it kept betraying her. That night it rained. Thunder shook the windows. Lightning lit up the mansion. She had just finished mopping the kitchen when Daniel appeared at the doorway. Come upstairs, he said gently. I shouldn't, she whispered. Just for a little while. Her feet didn't move. I promise you, he added. You'll be safe. Against every voice in her head, she followed. His room was warm, calm, quiet. He didn't touch her at first. He just asked her to sit. Then he poured her a glass of water. He asked how her mother was doing, if her brother had started school, if she had eaten. And somewhere in between those questions, she felt a human again. Seen, listened to, wanted. I don't want to hurt you, Grace, he said softly. She looked up, her eyes wet. Then don't make me fall for you. He walked closer. What if I already have? And in that moment something broke. Something fragile between fear and desire. And she let herself fall. Just a little. She stayed in his room that night. Not as a maid, but as a girl who had forgotten what it felt like to be loved. They said nothing about it the next day. But a secret had begun. A forbidden fire, hidden behind the mansion walls, was the beginning of something no one saw coming. She entered the mansion as a maid, but fate had other plans. The billionaire son is home, and Grace's life is about to change forever. Don't miss part 2. Everything is just beginning.